In this lecture, I'm going to talk about a very important principle in computer programming called command query separation. This principle states that our methods or functions should either be commands that perform an action and change the state of a system, or queries that return answer to the caller without changing the state or causing side effects. So our methods should either be commands or queries, but not both. Let's see this principle in action. So in the last lecture, you learned that this workbook object has a method called createSheet. This is an example of a command method because it's responsible for performing a task, the task of creating a sheet. As a result of calling this method, the state of our system, in this case, our workbook, changes. So every time we call it, we get a new sheet in this workbook. Now let's take a look at an example of a query method. So here we have this sheet that represents the first sheet in my workbook. In the last lecture, you learned about the cell method. We use this to access a cell in this sheet. This is an example of a query method. We use it to access a given cell. However, this method violates the command query separation principle. Let me show you why. I'm going to write a loop to print the value of all the cells in the first column. So for row in range 1, let's say to 10, we want to call sheet.cell, pass row here, and 1 as the column. We get the cell. Now we print cell.value. Let's run this program. So here are the values. We've got transaction ID followed by 3 rows of data and a bunch of non-objects. Now, after this loop, I'm going to call sheet.append to add a new row with these values. And finally, save the workbook as transactions2. Let's see what happens when we run this program. So run. Okay. Now I'm going to open up this transactions2. Here's the result. This new row that we added ended up here. But didn't we expect it to be right here after the last row? This is the result of violation of command query separation principle. Here's the reason. In this for loop, we're iterating over the first 10 rows to get the cell in the first column. Now, in our original spreadsheet, we only had 4 rows. These are the rows. So the heading row followed by 3 data rows. So when we use the for loop to iterate over the first 10 rows, the cell method magically created these new cells. In other words, when we call this method to access a cell at a given coordinate, if that cell doesn't exist, this method will create it for us. And this is the violation of command query separation principle. Because this is a query method, so it should not change the state of our system, in this case, the workbook. In other words, it should not have a side effect. So the developer who implemented this method probably had no idea of this very important principle in programming. So as you can see, the violation of this principle can create unexpected issues in your program. It makes it hard to reason about your code and figure out what is happening. So it would be better if this method raised an exception if we tried to access a cell that didn't exist. Similar to accessing the 4th item in a list of 3 items. Let me show you. So here we have a list of numbers, 1, 2, 3. If we try to access the 4th element, what happens? Our list will raise an exception. Or if we have a dictionary and try to access an item with an invalid key, again, our dictionary raises an exception. It doesn't magically create a key value pair with this key because here we're querying our dictionary. So earlier in the course, you learned that when we use square brackets to get an item with its key, a magic method called getItem will be called. This is a query method. It should not change the state of the system, or it should not have side effects. In other words, asking a question should not change the answer. So I thought this was a great opportunity for me to talk about the command query separation principle. It's very important. Make sure your methods are either commands or queries. And when using OpenPy Excel, be aware of how this cell method works. So if you generate an Excel spreadsheet and see some blank rows or columns, go back, check your code, and make sure you didn't accidentally reference those cells.